My first one, okay, let's do this. It says, how do you let people know the reason we celebrate Christmas without being weird about it? Christmas has become all about commercialism, Santa, and just another holiday that is disconnected from Jesus. I want to be a true witness to the truth of the gospel without letting the distractions confuse people, but I've also seen guys who treat everything as a pagan ritual, and it just seems ineffective.
Yeah. I don't know. It's just kind of a natural thing for me, around the Christmas season to be able to talk to people. I just look for opportunities in a conversation that I'm having with somebody when we're talking about presents, and it can be simple things like I've had parents ask me how many presents we get our kids, for example, and so I had a general rule that they weren't getting any more presents than Jesus got. So 3 presents, and right in there, you got an opening for the story of Jesus being born. So 3 presents: gold, frankincense, and myrrh. And the gold was a metal that symbolized deity, and it symbolized kingship. And frankincense was something that high priests used, and Jesus was our great high priest. Obviously, he's our king and our God. And then finally, myrrh was an embalming element. They used it for other things, but one of the major uses was for embalming, and that's kind of the shadow of the cross going across the manger. And so I've done that. By the way, the 3 gift thing, that didn't last very long because my wife is a nut. She's crazy. She's a crazy person. And if I ever die, my kids are going to be, traumatized around Christmas time because.
What do you mean? Like she gets too many?
Yeah, she just goes nuts on the gift giving thing. It's just,
I know.
Oh man.
When we had kids, it was the first grandchild or whatever, and I finally had to tell them, I'm like, listen, I don't have any more place to put all of this. I called it junk, but it's like you guys got to start buying lessons or something because, and it's they just want to give and stuff like that. But at some point, it's
got to stop, man.
Yeah.
So I would use things like that. I don't know. There's conversations that you have during the Christmas season that just naturally tend to open up the door for being able to share about Jesus. The whole pagan thing. As far as Christmas being a pagan festival, is nonsense. It's nonsense. This is one of those things that I thoroughly went through and checked out. There is not a pagan holiday that took place on Christmas Day. It didn't. And so people talk about Saturnalia, and people, they come up with all this stuff. The Feast of Sol Invictus. Well, the Feast of Sol Invictus was long after Christmas started. And Saturnalia was never on Christmas Day. And so you have these guys who go around and throw this stuff out about Christmas, and it just was not the case. The whole idea that Christmas was a feast where they were replacing some kind of pagan feast. Again, there were no pagan feasts on December 25th. It didn't happen. Before Christmas came along. In fact, most likely what happened was the pagans started doing a feast on Christmas Day. The whole idea of when Jesus was born had to do with tradition that you died on the same day that you were conceived. And so Jesus would have died, obviously, during the Passover. And so that would be in March, April. And the second century church believed it was in March. And so they taught that the conception of Jesus was at the same time. Well, you go March, April, May, June, July, August, September, October, November, December. And so they taught that Jesus was conceived on March 25th. And so therefore, he was born on December 25th. That's where the December 25th date came from, and it didn't come from any other place. And that's all the way from the 2nd century. And so it's an old tradition. And so the whole pagan thing, I used to buy into that because I was recommended a book called The Two Babylons by Alexander Hislop, and I found out later that his scholarship wasn't all that great. He was depending on he was referencing, giving references in his bibliography that weren't well founded, And so, I've since then kind of set that whole thing aside.
Sure.
So there were no Christmas trees in the first century. There were no Christmas trees during the time of Jeremiah. The Jeremiah passage where it talks about trimming a tree with silver and gold is not talking about Christmas trees. It's talking about idol worship and going out and cutting down a tree and making an idol and then putting silver and gold on the idol. So that's not speaking about Christmas trees. You don't have Christmas trees until the Middle Ages, and they came from paradise plays. They were literally plays that Christians put together that were reenacting the fall of man. And so the original Christmas trees came from the story of Adam and Eve and the tree of life and the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. And these paradise plays, they would, when they had them, they would have them in the middle of winter. And the only trees that had any foliage on them in the middle of winter were fir trees. And so that's where it came from. And in fact, the whole idea that the fruit that Adam and Eve ate was an apple, it came from those plays also. Mm-hmm. Because the only fruit that you still had around by December were apples. Because all the other fruit, they've been long out of date, basically, and apples will keep for a period of time, and so that's why they trim those trees with apples. So that's where all of those traditions came from, and so the Christmas tree is thoroughly Christian. It is not pagan. Now, if you want to look at something that's pagan, if you take the boughs off of Christmas trees and you start trimming your house with the little boughs, or you do little wreath type things, that kind of stuff. Pagans did do that, and so if you want to get technical about it, don't do any of that, but you can do a Christmas tree. Anyway, so I haven't bought into the whole pagan source of Christmas for a very long time because I actually went and checked those things out. Christmas is thoroughly Christian in the sense that it's not in the Bible, but it's something that Christians celebrate because of the incarnation. And the incarnation being the coming of Christ to the earth, coming of God down to earth, God with us. And so when I think about Christmas, there is nothing that is more thoroughly Christian and more thoroughly central to the story of the gospel than the fact that God came down. And so people who bag on that and walk away from it are missing an opportunity for evangelism that is just awesome, because most people don't have a problem with the baby Jesus laying in a manger.
Yeah, when you said that you checked that stuff out, like my I didn't grow up in church, so when I got saved, you want to come out of the world and you want to do what the Bible says and you want to live for the Lord. And so going all through that and you're looking at it and stuff, you're like, oh man, let's stop doing this, and then at some point you get weird to where people are looking at you. It's almost like what I would phrase as cultish, and I had to stop and be like, listen, this is totally pointless. It's ineffective. Whereas if you use the holiday and do all those things that you're doing anyway, they know you're a believer and you're living it in front of them. It's way more effective than a witness.
Right. Yeah. Even Santa Claus. People have a problem with Santa Claus, and I didn't really do Santa Claus in my house. When I did talk to my kids about Santa Claus, Santa Claus was a pastor. The guy was a pastor in Turkey, and his name was Saint Nicholas, and he was known for being kind to the poor. And the whole story about Saint Nicholas coming into your house and leaving gifts had to do with a story where there was a guy who had lost his living because he became a Christian. He'd been a rich man, and he became a Christian, and he lost everything. And when his daughters got older and needed a dowry so that they could get married, Saint Nicholas, snuck up to the house and through the window. He didn't come down the chimney; they didn't have chimneys. But he came up to the window, and he left a bag of money for the first girl's dowry, and he got caught the second time that he did it. And so that's where the whole idea of Saint Nicholas coming to your house comes from. And so when I would talk to guys on my construction crews, or guys that I knew in the world, and they'd talk about, well, they might say something like, well, I don't really focus on Jesus and stuff. I focus on Santa Claus. I go, you know who Santa Claus is, don't you?
Yeah.
And then I just tell them the story of Santa Claus and that he's a godly guy and loves the Lord, and he's bowing before the Lord right now.
Yeah. So to me, that kind of like brings them into the holiday, whereas if the other one just kind of excludes them,
Right.
almost
Yeah.
like on a legalistic standpoint.
Yeah, exactly. And so, if you want to cap on pagan stuff, there are a couple things that are pagan in Christmas celebrations. So mistletoe, don't do mistletoe. That God will kill you if you do. And Yule logs, and most of us don't even know what a Yule log is, so that's not an issue. Those are things that came from pagan winter worship and that kind of stuff. In Easter bunnies, no Easter bunnies. That's thoroughly Babylonian and that kind of stuff. Easter's about the resurrection of Jesus. So, two of the two holidays that non-Christians tend to attend church are the two holidays that are the central focus of the gospel: the incarnation, God being with us, and the resurrection, Jesus rising from the dead. And so,
okay, since you just said that, I got one Christmas on that. So it says, the question says, do I continue to invite my family to Christmas service every year when they don't come to church any other time? What do you say?
Anytime you can get somebody out to hear the gospel, I would be taking any opportunity that I could, because I understand that you get irritated and it's like, why don't you people just go for it and that kind of thing. But you got to remember where you were at when you first got saved, and a lot of times there's a blindness that's taken place there, and you never know when the Lord's going to break through.
You never know. Some people are stubborn, man.
Yeah.
Some guys like you almost give up on. I've seen people like 15, 20 years down the road, and it's always cool when they get saved and they're like in their 50s or something. I've had friends get saved there in their 50s, and it's like, wow.
That's a miracle.
Yeah.
When I even in our church, there are people who come to my church that I have a really, I may not know for sure. There have been some times in the past when I knew for sure that there were guys coming to my church and they were not saved. And every week, I'm sitting there looking at them going, dude, what are you doing here? Because this has got to be brutal for you, just hearing about your sin and that kind of thing every time. And then, at some point, a lot of these guys, they lift their hands up and they give their heart to Jesus, and God just gets a hold of them. So yeah, I would take every opportunity. Better than that, though, bringing them to church and that kind of thing is great, because you bring them to church, or I don't know if you go to our church or if you go to another church. Hopefully, if you're going to another church, hopefully the pastor's faithful to give an invitation and that kind of thing. That's a cool thing, and I do that. But even better than that is the witness that you give them. I love it when I hear about people who lead their family members to the Lord and then bring them to church, because they've got an immediate connection with you, and I think that a lot of times, actually the guys that I've led to the Lord personally, one-on-one, just kind of out in the world, I think many times that's a really effective type of situation, because even though we're not churchy here, the church stuff is not involved. And it's just a real focus on a relationship with Christ. So even if they're not coming to church, or even if they're coming to church only on Christmas, you can still be a witness to them all during the year, and hopefully bring them into a closer walk with the Lord. So
yeah, amen. Yeah.